In this approach, the phobic patient is invited to intend, even if only for a moment, precisely that which he fears. Viktor Frankl. Zur medikamentösen Unterstützung der Psychotherapie bei Neurosen. Schweizer Archiv für Neurology and Psychiatry, Volume 43, page 26, 31. Let me recall a case. A young physician consulted me because of his fear of perspiring. Whenever he expected an outbreak of perspiration, this anticipatory anxiety was enough to precipitate excessive sweating. In order to cut this circle formation, I advised the patient, in the event that sweating should recur, to resolve deliberately to show people how much he could sweat. A week later, he returned to report that whenever he met anyone who triggered his anticipatory anxiety, he said to himself, "I only sweated out a quart before, but now I'm going to pour at least 10 quarts." The result was that, after suffering from his phobia for 4 years, he was able, after a single session, to free himself permanently of it within 1 week. The reader will note that this procedure consists of a reversal of the patient's attitude, inasmuch as his fear is replaced by a paradoxical wish. By this treatment, the wind is taken out of the sails of the anxiety. Such a procedure, however, must make use of the specifically human capacity for self-detachment, inherent in a sense of humor. This basic capacity to detach one from oneself is actualized whenever the logotherapeutic technique called paradoxical intention is applied. At the same time, the patient is enabled to put himself at a distance from his own neuroses. A statement consistent with this is found in Gordon W. Allport's book, The Individual and His Religion. The neurotic who learns to laugh at himself may be on the way to self-management, perhaps to cure. New York, The Macmillan Co., 1956, p. 92. Paradoxical intention is the empirical validation and clinical application of Allport's statement. A few more case reports may serve to clarify this method further. The following patient was a success. When he was admitted to my hospital department, he was in extreme despair, confessing that he was close to suicide. For some years he had suffered from a writer's cramp which had recently become so severe that he was in danger of losing his job. Therefore, only immediate short-term therapy could alleviate the situation. In starting treatment, Dr. Eva Kozera recommended to the patient that he do just the opposite of what he usually had done, namely, instead of trying to write as neatly and legibly as possible, to write with the worst possible scrawl. He was advised to say to himself, "Now I will show people what a good scribbler I am." And at a moment in which he deliberately tried to scribble, he was unable to do so. "I tried to scrawl but simply could not do it," he said the next day. Within 48 hours, the patient was in this way freed from his writer's cramp and remained free for the observation period after he had been treated. He is a happy man again and fully able to work. A similar case, dealing however with speaking rather than writing, was related to me by a colleague in the laryngological department of the Vienna Polyclinic Hospital. It was the most severe case of stuttering he had come across in his many years of practice. Never in his life, as far as the stutterer could remember, had he been free from his speech trouble, even for a moment, except once. This happened when he was 12 years old and had hooked a ride on a streetcar. When caught by the conductor, he thought that the only way to escape would be to elicit his sympathy, and so he tried to demonstrate that he was just a poor stuttering boy. At that moment when he tried to stutter, he was unable to do it. Without meaning to, he had practiced paradoxical intention, though not for therapeutic purposes. However, this presentation should not leave the impression that paradoxical intention is effective only in monosymptomatic cases. By means of this logotherapeutic technique, my staff at the Vienna Polyclinic Hospital has succeeded in bringing relief even in obsessive-compulsive neuroses of a most severe degree and duration. I refer, for instance, to a woman 65 years of age who had suffered for 60 years from a washing compulsion. Dr. Eva Kozeter started logotherapeutic treatment by means of paradoxical intention, and 2 months later the patient was able to lead a normal life. Before admission to the neurological department of the Vienna Polyclinic Hospital, she had confessed, "Life was hell for me." Handicapped by her compulsion and bacteriophobic obsession, she finally remained in bed all day, unable to do any housework. It would not be accurate to say that she is now completely free of symptoms, for an obsession may come to her mind. However, she is able to joke about it, as she says. In short, to apply paradoxical intention. Paradoxical intention can also be applied in cases of sleep disturbance. The fear of sleeplessness 12 results in a hyperintention to fall asleep, which in turn incapacitates the patient to do so. To overcome this particular fear, I usually advise the patient not to try to sleep, but rather to try to do just the opposite, that is, to stay awake as long as possible. In other words, the hyperintention to fall asleep, arising from the anticipatory anxiety of not being able to do so, must be replaced by the paradoxical intention not to fall asleep, which soon will be followed by sleep. The fear of sleeplessness is in the majority of cases due to the patient's ignorance of the fact that the organism provides itself, by itself, with the minimum amount of sleep really needed. Paradoxical intention is no panacea, yet it lends itself as a useful tool in treating obsessive-compulsive and phobic conditions, especially in cases with underlying anticipatory anxiety. Moreover, it is a short-term therapeutic device. However, one should not conclude that such a short-term therapy necessarily results in only temporary therapeutic effects. One of the more common illusions of Freudian orthodoxy, to quote the late Emil A. Gutheel, is that the durability of results corresponds to the length of therapy. In my files, there is, for instance, the case report of a patient to whom paradoxical intention was administered more than 20 years ago. The therapeutic effect proved to be, nevertheless, a permanent one. American Journal of Psychotherapy, 1956, page 134, etiological basis of the case concerned. This confirms a statement once made by Edith Bose-Kochulson. Although traditional psychotherapy has insisted that therapeutic practices have to be based on findings on etiology, it is possible that certain factors might cause neuroses during early childhood and that entirely different factors might relieve neuroses during adulthood. Some comments on a Viennese School of Psychiatry, the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, 1955, pages 701 through 3. As for the actual causation of neurosciences, apart from constitutional elements, whether somatic or psychic in nature, such feedback mechanisms as anticipatory anxiety seem to be a major pathogenic factor. A given symptom is responded to by a phobia, the phobia triggers the symptom, and the symptom in turn reinforces the phobia. A similar chain of events, however, can be observed in obsessive-compulsive cases in which the patient fights the ideas which haunt him 15 times daily. Thereby, however, he increases their power to disturb him, since pressure precipitates counter-pressure. Again, the symptom is reinforced. On the other hand, as soon as the patient stops fighting his paradoxical intention, the vicious circle is cut, the symptom diminishes, and finally atrophies. In the fortunate case where there is no existential vacuum, which invites and elicits the symptom, the ignoring it. This is often motivated by the patient's fear that his obsessions indicate an imminent or even actual psychosis. The patient is not aware of the empirical fact that an obsessive-compulsive neurosis is immunizing him against a formal psychosis, rather than endangering him in this direction. As we see, anticipatory anxiety has to be counteracted by paradoxical intention. Hyperintention as well as hyperreflection have to be counteracted by dereflection. Dereflection, however, ultimately is not possible except by the patient's orientation toward his specific vocation and mission in life. It is not the neurotic self-concern, whether pity or contempt, which breaks the circle formation. The cue to cure is self-transcendence. This conviction is supported by Allport, who once said, as the focus of striving shifts from the conflict to selfless goals, the life as a whole becomes sounder, even though the neurosis may never completely disappear. People's System, 95. Every age has its own collective neurosis, and every age needs its own psychotherapy to cope with it. The existential vacuum, which is the mass neurosis of the present time, can be described as a private and personal form of nihilism, for nihilism can be defined as the contention that being has no meaning. As for psychotherapy, however, it will never be able to cope with this state of affairs of a nihilistic philosophy. Otherwise, it represents a symptom of the mass neurosis rather than its possible cure.
Psychotherapy would not only reflect a nihilistic philosophy, but also, even though unwillingly and unwittingly, transmit to the patient what is actually a caricature rather than a true picture of man. First of all, there is a danger inherent in the teaching of man's nothing butness, the theory that man is nothing but the result of biological, psychological, and sociological conditions, or the product of heredity and environment. Such a view of man makes a neurotic believe what he is prone to believe anyway, namely that he is the pawn and victim of outer influences or inner circumstances. This neurotic fatalism is fostered and strengthened by a psychotherapy which denies that man is free. To be sure, a human being is a finite thing, and his freedom is restricted. It is not freedom from conditions, but it is freedom to take a stand toward the conditions. As I once put it, as a professor in two fields, neurology and psychiatry, I am fully aware of the extent to which man is subject to biological, psychological, and sociological conditions. But in addition to being a professor in two fields, I am a survivor of 4 camps, concentration camps, that is, and as such, I also bear witness to the conceivable value dimensions in teaching. A color television film produced by Hollywood Animators, Inc., for the California Junior College Association. Critique of pandemonism, psychoanalysis, has often been blamed for its so-called pansexualism. I, for one, doubt whether this reproach has ever been legitimate. However, there is something which seems to me to be an even more erroneous and dangerous assumption, namely that which I call pandeterminism. By that, man is not fully conditioned and determined, but rather determines himself, whether he gives in to conditions or stands up to them. In other words, man is ultimately self-determining. Man does not simply exist, but always decides what his existence will be, what he will become in the next moment. By the same token, every human being has the freedom to change at any instant. Therefore, we can predict his future only within the large framework of a statistical survey referring to a whole group. The individual personality, however, remains essentially unpredictable. The basis for any predictions would be represented by biological, psychological, or sociological conditions. Yet, one of the main features of human existence is the capacity to rise above such conditions, to grow beyond them. Man is capable of changing the world for the better if possible, and of changing himself for the better if necessary. Let me cite the case of Dr. J. He was the only man I ever encountered in my whole life whom I would dare to call a Mephistophelian being, a satanic figure. At that time, he was generally called the mass murderer of Steinhof, the large mental hospital in Vienna. When the Nazis started their euthanasia program, he held all the strings in his hands and was so fanatic in the job assigned to him that he tried not to let one single psychotic individual escape the gas chamber. After the war, when I came back to Vienna, I asked what had happened to Dr. J. Jatjev, he had been imprisoned by the Russians in one of the isolation cells of Steinhof, they told me. The next day, however, the door of his cell stood open and Dr. J was never seen again. Later, I was convinced that, like others, he had, with the help of his comrades, made his way to South America. More recently, however, I was consulted by a former Austrian diplomat who had been imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain for many years, first in Siberia and then in the famous Lubyanka prison in Moscow. While I was examining him neurologically, he suddenly asked me whether I happened to know Dr. J. After my affirmative reply, he continued, I made his acquaintance in Lubyanka. There he died at about the age of 40 from cancer of the urinary bladder. Before he died, however, he showed himself to be the best comrade you can imagine. He gave consolation to everybody. He lived up to the highest conceivable moral standard. He was the best friend I ever met during my long years in prison. This is the story of Dr. J, the mass murderer of Steinhof. How can we dare to predict the behavior of man? We may predict the movements of a machine, of an automaton. More than this, we may even try to predict the mechanisms or dynamisms of the human psyche as well. But man is more than psyche. Freedom, however, is not the last word. Freedom is only part of the story and half of the truth. Responsibleness. In fact, freedom is in danger of degenerating into mere arbitrariness unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness. That is why/recommend that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be supplemented by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. Freedom. Therefore, a residue of freedom, however limited it may be, is left to man in neurotic and even psychotic cases. Indeed, the innermost core of the patient's personality is not even touched by a psychosis. An incurably psychotic individual may lose his usefulness, but yet retain the dignity of a human being. This is my psychiatric credo. Without it, I should not think it worthwhile to be a psychiatrist. For whose sake? Just for the sake of a damaged brain machine which cannot be repaired? If the patient were not definitely more, euthanasia would be justified. For too long a time, for half a century, in fact, psychiatry tried to interpret the human mind merely as a mechanism, and consequently the therapy of mental disease merely in terms of a technique. I believe this dream has been dreamt out. What now begins to loom on the horizon are not the sketches of a psychologized medicine, but rather those of a humanized psychiatry. A doctor, however, who would still interpret his own role mainly as that of a technician would confess that he sees in his patient nothing more than a machine, instead of seeing the human being behind the disease. A human being is not one thing among others. Things determine each other, but man is ultimately self-determining. What he becomes within the limits of endowment and environment, he has made out of himself. In the concentration camps, for example. In this living laboratory and on this testing ground, we watched and witnessed some of our comrades behave like swine, while others behave like saints. Man has both potentialities within himself. Which one is actualized depends on decisions, but not on conditions. Our generation is realistic, for we have come to know man as he really is. After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Yisrael on his lips. Postscript. The case for a tragic optimism, dedicated to the memory of Edith Weisskopf-Joelson, whose pioneering efforts in logotherapy in the United States began as early as and whose contributions to the field have been invaluable. This Germany, June 1983. Let us first ask ourselves what should be understood by a tragic optimism. In brief, it means that one is and remains optimistic in spite of the tragic triad, as it is called in logotherapy, a triad which consists of those aspects of human existence which may be circumscribed by pain, guilt, and three, death. This chapter, in fact, raises the question, how is it possible to say yes to life in spite of all that? How, to pose the question differently, can life retain its potential meaning in spite of its tragic aspects? After all, saying yes to life in spite of everything, to use the phrase in which the title of a German book of mine is couched, presupposes that life is potentially meaningful under any conditions, even those which are most miserable. And this, in turn, presupposes the human capacity to creatively turn life's negative aspects into something positive or constructive. In other words, what matters is to make the best of any given situation. The best, however, is that which in Latin is called optimum, hence the reason I speak of a tragic optimism, that is, an optimism in the face of tragedy and in view of the human potential, which at its best always allows for 1, turning suffering into a human achievement and accomplishment, 2, deriving from guilt the opportunity to change oneself for the better, and 3, deriving from life's transitoriness an incentive to take responsible action. It must be kept in mind, however, that optimism is not anything to be commanded or ordered. One cannot even force oneself to be optimistic indiscriminately, against all odds, against all hope. And love cannot be commanded or ordered either. To the European, it is a characteristic of the American culture that again and again, one is commanded and ordered to be happy, but happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. One must have a reason to be happy. Once the reason is found, however, one becomes happy automatically. As we see, a human being is not one in pursuit of happiness, but rather in search of a reason to become happy, last but not least through actualizing the potential meaning inherent and dormant in a given situation. This need for a reason is similar in another specifically human phenomenon, laughter. If you want anyone to laugh, you have to provide him with a reason, e.g., you have to tell him a joke. In no way is it possible to evoke real laughter by urging him or having him urge himself to laugh. Doing so would be the same as urging people posed in front of a camera to say cheese, only to find that in the finished photographs, their faces are frozen in artificial smiles. In logotherapy, such a behavior pattern is called hyperintention. It plays an important role in the causation of sexual neurosis, be it frigidity or impotence. The more a patient, instead of forgetting himself through giving himself, directly strives for orgasm, i.e., sexual pleasure, the more this pursuit of sexual pleasure becomes self-defeating. Indeed, what is called the pleasure principle is, rather, a fun spoiler. Once an individual's search for a meaning is successful, it not only renders him happy, but also gives him the capability to cope with suffering. And what happens if one's groping for a meaning has been in vain? This may well result in a fatal condition. Let us recall, for instance, what sometimes happened in extreme situations, such as prisoner of war camps or concentration camps. In the first, as I was told by American soldiers, a behavior pattern crystallized to which they referred as give up itis. In the concentration camps, this behavior was paralleled by those who one morning at 5 refused to get up and go to work and instead stayed in the hut on the straw, wet with urine and feces. Nothing, neither warnings nor threats, could induce them to change their minds. And then something typical occurred. They took out a cigarette from deep down in a pocket where they had hidden it and started smoking. At that moment, we knew that for the next 48 hours or so, we would watch them dying, meaning orientation had subsided and consequently the seeking of immediate pleasure had taken over. Is this not reminiscent of another parallel, a parallel that confronts us day by day? I think of those youngsters who, on a worldwide scale, refer to themselves as the no future generation. To be sure, it is not just a cigarette to which they resort, it is drugs. In fact, the drug scene is one aspect of a more general mass phenomenon, namely the feeling of universal phenomenon in our industrial societies. Today, it is not only logotherapists who claim that the feeling of meaninglessness plays an ever increasing role in the etiology of neurosis. As Irvin D. Yalom of Stanford University states in Existential Psychotherapy, of 40 consecutive patients applying for therapy at a psychiatric outpatient clinic, 12 had some major problem involving meaning as adjudged from self ratings, therapists, or independent judges. Thousands of miles east of Palo Alto, the situation differs only by percent. The most recent pertinent statistics indicate that in Vienna, percent of the population complain that meaning is missing from their lives. Basic Books, New York, 1980, P4848. As to the causation of the feeling of meaninglessness, one may say, albeit in an oversimplifying vein, that people have enough to live by, but nothing to live for. They have the means, but no meaning. To be sure, some do not even have the means. In particular, I think of the mass of people who are today unemployed. 50 years ago, I published a study too, devoted to a specific type of depression I had diagnosed in cases of young patients suffering from what I called unemployment neurosis. And I could show that this neurosis really originated in a twofold erroneous identification. Being jobless was equated with being useless, and being useless was equated with having a meaningless life. Consequently, whenever I succeeded in persuading the patients to volunteer in youth organizations, adult education, public libraries, and the like, in other words, as soon as they could fill although their economic situation had not changed and their hunger was the same, the truth is that man does not live by welfare alone. Wirtschaftsreise und Seelenleben vom Standpunkt des Jugendberaters, Sozialschrieke Rundschau, Volt 1933, P43 to 46, along with unemployment neurosis, which is triggered by an individual's socioeconomic situation, conditions, whichever the case may be. Accordingly, psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy are indicated respectively. Insofar as the feeling of meaninglessness is concerned, however, we should not overlook and forget that, per se, it is not a matter of pathology. Rather than being the sign and symptom of a neurosis, it is, I would say, the proof of one's humanness. But although it is not caused by anything pathological, it may well cause a pathological reaction. In other words, it is potentially pathogenic. Just consider the mass neurotic syndrome so pervasive in the young generation. There is ample empirical evidence that the three facets of this syndrome, depression, aggression, addiction, are due to what is called in logotherapy the existential vacuum, a feeling of emptiness and meaninglessness. Nor does suicide, in which depression sometimes eventuates, always result from an existential vacuum. But even if each and every case of suicide had not been undertaken out of a feeling of meaninglessness, it may well be that an individual's impulse to take his life would have been overcome had he been aware of some meaning and purpose worth living for. If thus a strong meaning orientation plays a decisive role in the prevention of suicide, what about intervention in cases in which there is a suicide risk? As a young doctor, I spent 4 years in Austria's, were accommodated, most of them having been admitted after a suicide attempt. I once calculated that I must have explored 12,000 patients during those 4 years. What accumulated was prone to suicide. Explain to such a person that patients have repeatedly told me how happy they were that the suicide attempt had not been successful. Weeks, months, years later, they told me, it turned out that there was a solution to their problem, an answer to their question, a meaning to their life. Even if things only take such a good turn in one of 1,000 cases, my explanation continues, who can guarantee that in your case, it will not happen one day sooner or later?